Welcome back, everybody. Rich Buger, Shanghai-based social entrepreneur, here today with Cyrille Filott, who is the strategist for consumer foods with Rabobank. Really lucky to be capturing him here today in Shanghai as part of their global conference. Agriculture, startup, some sustainability issues, really get into the weeds, or the wheat, as it were, talking about like what are the big topics around sustainability, what's going on, big brand, but also within the startup space, and how does their bank fit into this?
So my name is Cyrille Filott. I'm the strategist for consumer foods, which is a bit of a funny title, but I'll come to that. For those who don't know Rabobank, we are the leading food and agribusiness bank. We finance from seed to shelf or from farm to fork, but providing banking solutions to everybody in the value chain. And what makes us unique is that we have a team of close to 100 analysts covering from an industry perspective the value chain. And I'm one of those. I'm covering the consumer sector, and I had a team of 10 people who are interested in everything that's happening around consumer, which could be retail, private label, brands, sustainability, anything that is relevant for the customers of the bank.
If you're looking at the work that you do in research and insights, and then applying that to the decisions made by the bank, where does sustainability fall into this right now?
As a bank that is involved in many parts of the value chain, it's tough. It is difficult because on the one hand, let's take dairy. Milk is nutritious. Yeah. But the carbon footprint of dairy cows is interesting. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of trading of certain goods going on, so there's a lot of shipping stuff around the globe. A lot of water is being shipped, basically. That's a challenge. On the other side of the spectrum, where I'm involved, is nutrition. So we know all the issues around food and what it brings to people and what it shouldn't bring to people, but does bring to people. So what role should we play? And that's a debate that we have. And I can't necessarily say we have found the answer, but we are changing as an institution to take a more active position.
How do you, as in supporting your clients or supporting your organization, how do you navigate that differently now? And then what are the big questions around that?
So we've identified a few transitions that we should be part of. One of them is around greenhouse gases, so help reducing greenhouse gas emissions, digitization and what it can bring in terms of knowledge, in terms of insights, in terms of, for example, shortening supply chain. Those are key transitions for us to be part of. And the third one is related to food waste, which is relatively straightforward, perhaps as a theme, but it's an important one. Yeah. So those are the ones that we really try to help, providing better solutions, financial solutions, supporting those that are trying to make a difference.
Across the value chain, where are the hottest areas for sustainability right now? Like, where's the biggest challenge that you see more organizations, be it at the consumer side or farmer side, really trying to tackle?
There's so many, to be honest, of areas but they differ. So it's different at every farm level, and that's why we as an institution came up, for example, with greenhouse gas emissions as a key driver, where we really want to make a change, because everybody in the chain has a role there to play, which doesn't apply to all the sustainability topics. For me personally, I've been putting nutrition on the agenda, but that's on the consumer foods companies. They are truly interested in how can we help. Not all, by the way. Some companies are interested in, we need to provide better products. We need to provide better food. And they're also interested in, for example, what governments are doing. What you see happening in the European market and to a degree in the US market is the introduction of scoring systems, rating systems. There's Nutri-Score that's going to be launched in Europe. Nutri-Score is very simple. On various metrics, you get an A, B, C, D, or E. And an A is great and E is bad. And it will be on a package. And consumers will pick and choose according to that.
Then what's the role of the bank in this when it comes to helping an organization figure out A to E? And how do you incentivize or disincentivize to also reduce your own risk financially?
So there's a few things there. One, creating awareness, because you would be shocked how many even of the larger food companies are not always aware of issues like Nutri-Score or the broader sustainability issues. It continues to surprise me how in some organizations, definitely not all, how the awareness levels are very much low on these type of issues and very much focused on day to day. We need to sell economics. So that's one thing. How can we incentivize A to E? No. Not necessarily from a nutritional point of view, because that would be an audit process that would be not achievable. But we do it, as I said, with green bonds, which is preferential rate financing on certain projects. Right. But that's much more about, for example, having a solar farm next to your factory, or wind energy, or biomass energy, those type of projects, or equipment that is just much more efficient. Right. So that's something we definitely do. I think what we are about is about providing financing, providing knowledge, where I come in, and providing the network. And I think that is the important element that we bring. And I mentioned startups before. We are very much involved with the startup space in every part of the value chain again. We run our own startup pitch contest called Food Bites. And we are now at edition number 16, if I'm not mistaken, which is a pitch contest where startups that can share their deck with us. And we receive about 150 per episode. And the best 10, what we believe are the best 10 or 15, they're allowed to pitch for an audience of our clients. Right. So in the last edition in London last year, there were 500 people in the audience, just listening, getting inspired by those startups, and then we make the connections. The Food Bites edition last year in London was won by a company that is producing or will produce a product that zaps wheat. So basically it sends an electric pulse to wheat, but what it does before that, with a camera, it recognizes whether it's wheat or not. Okay. And that at a very high speed, so it goes over the field and then it basically zaps the wheat using electricity instead of herbicides or pesticides or whatever, herbicides in this case, of course. So day one, we made a connection with a large farm input company, and they're now working together.
So what do you get out of it?
This goes back to being purpose-led. Yeah. So this is for us growing that better world together. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that we get out of it. Secondly, of our current client base, they love these type of startups and making the connection because they may also see the same issues that we are seeing around sustainability and that you are talking about on a daily basis. So they are very interested in making investments in companies like that.
How have you seen maybe some of the larger organizations learn from, be inspired by these startups who are just out there? And are the best business ideas the sustainable ones, like we're greener, we're safer, or is it more operational? We help you save money, we help you make more money. Like,
it can be all of the above, really. And it could be we will help you make more money. We give you the distribution platform. We give you the R&D capabilities or the mentoring. Even just mentoring, as in because a startup can be 10, 15 people who have no business sense or limited business sense, and help them with that. So in that sense, it works both ways. Another company that pitched with us last year, and which we did really well, is a company called Mimica, who produces a device that you can put on a carton or plastic or a jar of milk, and basically it pops out when the milk is no longer fresh. So instead of the sell-by date, it's a different. So it's also when it is in the supply chain, it may be actually not always in cold storage by coincidence. So that this thing measures that at a very cheap price, by the way. So it reduces food waste. There was a dairy company was in the audience who said, "Love it," and that's a client of ours, of course. So they loved it. They worked together, and I'm not sure whether this will launch, but at least it inspires them to think differently than just printing the sell-by date. And reducing waste, because that's in the end goal. Yeah. And
that feeds back into your own, like one of your big categories of reducing food waste and food loss. Yes. So then I really struggle with, in Asia, these entrepreneurs, how do they scale up to meet the need of these challenges, be it food waste or greenhouse or whatever? Yeah. I mean, in your opinion, who's best positioned for that? Is it the big Unilevers, Cargills, ADMs, or is it going to be the new upstarts, the plant-based proteins, the almond, the milk replacements that we keep hearing about all these entrepreneurs. Yes. Who do you think is going to deliver the solutions?
Yes, so this varies where they sit in the value chain, by the way, because many of the technology companies, they will not make it on their own, in my view. They should become, like the wheat zapper that I mentioned before, they should become something bigger and build from there. Well, you mentioned meat substitutes. They are capable of doing it on their own. So because the good thing that they have is that they can outsource a lot of the production. So what they need is the innovation skills and the distribution. And in this case also, well, interested consumers. So consumers are going to ask for this and then retailers have to stock it, and it's a sort of a flywheel effect. So it varies a bit where we sit in the value chain. So when we talk about consumers in Asia and consumer food products in Asia, I would like to think that this is going to be retail driven, perhaps even platform driven. Alibaba, JD.com, currently it's not on the forefront of the mind, but if the consumer here, and so especially probably the high-end consumer who is getting more and more interested in sustainability, are going to ask for this. Well, actually, Alibaba and JD.com, they sit on the data, so they will at one point notice and go back into the system, who is going to supply me with this? Right. And that may not be big food. Right. And the big brands that are existing. It could be local products that you mentioned. So it is. I think the platforms will be the first ones who are going to capture that demand, when it's demand driven, and then make the connection to the supplier.
So does that make local, sustainable, purpose-led a threat to the bigger organizations that you talk to? Like, are they worried about this trend right now? Yes. And then how are they asking different questions, or how are they acting differently now that they're seeing? I mean, particularly in plant-based, we're seeing this now. So
let's go back, and unfortunately she didn't make it as a CEO of Campbell's Soup, Denise Morrison, who Campbell's was a company that was changing to become this purpose-led company, but she wasn't given the time by her shareholders, which is an interesting sort of side question, as in the ownership structure. Yeah. But she said Campbell's in time might be a large organization of smaller brands. Okay. Because of the consumer looking for local, for provenance, for clean label. And what you see in the market happening anyway, and this is around sustainability, but perhaps in a broader sense as well, I am not convinced that we will have as many billion-dollar brands in the future than we have now. Perhaps because of the growth in Asia, some of the US, European brands may grow here and become a billion-dollar brand as a result. Right. But new launches in those markets will be much more targeted to people with certain preferences. So my preference might be around, my lifestyle. I may be a vegan, I may prefer lactose-free food, I may prefer, some sort of premium type of product. But that's a niche group. Right. So and this will be confirmed by big food companies. It will be smaller, higher margin by the way, but smaller subset of people that they're looking for, and so they're going to be much more targeted, much less mass market, much more targeted. So that's it. So that is going. So the composition of business of big food companies and the portfolios, they will change over time.
My next question is, how will your bank adjust around that, or how will banking in general adjust? Because we're set up right now financially to support the bigger operators. Yes. Because it's easier to service, everything. But when you're talking about like startup entrepreneurs who've got maybe 5 million, 10 million, they're not very attractive. Yeah. How do we bridge that gap, or how will you change to bridge that gap?
One of the things we did is set up our own fund. Okay. And invest in interesting startups that we believe are interesting. So, is that the role of a bank? You can discuss that, but at least it's putting money where your mouth is in this case. We believe in these startups, so we set up a fund, invested it. We are participating in other funds who are doing the same thing. So we are then a limited partner in a bigger fund. So on the equity side is what we are doing, providing the platform. And we're thinking about, we haven't launched it yet, about providing sort of higher yield capital to those startups. But the risks are enormous, which for a bank makes it,
Yeah. But when we talk about transition, this is a very important part of the transition. If you can't get the funding to these organizations to reach scale, making that
funding for startups is currently not an issue, but it's not by banks. It is by venture capital and private equity.
Right.
And as long as interest rates are where they are, there's an abundance of capital to flow into this market. So only if we are entering a period with higher interest rates, that may change. But to be honest, in my sector, in consumer foods, there are too many startups.
Yeah.
For those that are interested in the consumer food sector, they should travel to Natural Products Expo West, which is an annual trade show in Anaheim, in California. 3,500 companies are there, most of them young companies, 3 to 5 years old, perhaps even young. It's just too many, and they all have the same idea. That's not entirely true, but so currently I'm not worried about startups getting them to the first phase. There's a point where they need to become more than just an idea. That's what you talked about as well. Yeah. And that is where we can play a role, making the connection. And well, being a broker between a startup and a larger company. And there's money to be made there.
And so do you see like the industrial M&A being much more interesting for these small startups and as well as for the big brands, or?
Industrial M&A being?
Well, it's like the corporate M&A. So Unilever buys up
that is, so we will see a change in that, or we are witnessing. We are in the midst of a change there where we don't see the large, big deals anymore. Yeah. I think potentially, and don't hold this, you can't quote me on this because it will be on video, but when Kraft Heinz didn't win Unilever, that may be the end of an era. That was the first big mega merger that didn't happen. And we've seen a lot of mergers in beer, we've seen a lot of mergers in food. And the reason why Unilever didn't want to be part of that big organization. Right. And since then, even in Kraft Heinz, you've seen a lot of change. Kraft Heinz set up their Springboard Accelerator program. They have the venture program. They bought Primal Kitchen, which is a keto diet company, which is sort of the heart of something that they want to build out. I'm not saying that the Kraft Heinz is purpose-led, but at least they're playing into what some consumers want, into a targeted audience there. So those type of transactions is I think what we'll see more of going forward.
And what do you think that means for firms like Unilever, Kraft? Like they're buying up all these purpose-led entrepreneurs that might be 100 million, 300 million in sales. Yeah. How does that change the company like that you've seen so far? Like in change management, does it infect up? Does it make it easier for Unilever to fulfill their USLP?
There's more to just acquiring these companies. Specifically for Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, it is bottom up and it's top down. And I think the challenge is actually in the middle. So how do you get the middle management layer to make the changes, to execute on the plans and the KPIs? Because I think Unilever Sustainable Living Plan is interesting because they KPI'd quite a few of their targets basically. They made it real KPIs for the organization, which is very much driven by the senior management. And I think the younger people and the companies they're buying into, they support that, of course, wholeheartedly. It's just that middle layer that takes just the longest time. But that's in any change management process. Yeah. It takes a lot of time.
With respect to consumers, who's leading the sustainability charge right now, and what's driving them towards a sustainable food, sustainable agriculture?
Which consumers you mean? As in to be honest, it's the urban consumer. Okay. Interestingly, because you would think that more rural areas where farmers are present, that actually they would be more interested. But you do see that it is the urban consumer who is very much interested in the broader sustainability aspect. So it's not only food; it's the electrical cars and all that. And they are the key driver. But the urban consumer is wealthier. They have the money to spend on those type of things. Because the lower class, even in Western markets, they don't care that much. They're still looking for cheap calories, unfortunately. And that is, by the way, a slight concern that I have, going slightly off-piste here. But I lived in the UK when the recession hit in 2007. The UK was one of the first countries where the recession hit for the financial crisis. The only company that had to hire people was McDonald's. They grew.
They grew.
Because they had cheap calories.
Yeah.
Of course, McDonald's is changing as well, but this is 10 years ago. And that's so. With a recession, will people still buy the more premium type of stuff, or will they actually move to you know?
So one of the challenges around urbanization, cheap calories, is just how do we scale up these systems?
Yes.
And we've seen the fires in Amazon, but also Africa, Southeast Asia. Is that system, the scalability of the system, and the negative externalities, is that driving different decisions right now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I do see some changes, but for retailers and food companies, in the end, it is money that makes them tick. It's not in the end, but money is very important. So it is what the consumer wants and what the retailer wants. Retailers are changing, not all, but some retailers are changing, and try to change their supply chains a bit, more local, more provenance, all that. Interesting. I have a lot of belief in the platforms. Okay. I will be proven wrong. Because I can be proven wrong. But Ocado, which is the UK retailer, only online, only delivery, they've invested in vertical farms. I find that very interesting, and I haven't got the answer yet whether they do that because it is consumer driven and that they want to deliver as quickly as possible, or whether that's a sustainability element towards it, as in why ship it from I don't know where and it takes this long. Probably both, to be honest. So those that have the insights in consumers, but also have the logistical prowess, so they can make this difference, and which makes, by the way, and they will make sure that supply chains are getting shorter, and that you get more local production of certain. And
I think that really supports more entrepreneurs over time.
Yes, you wouldn't necessarily need a big food company with big distribution, as long as you're able to logistically ship your stuff to a warehouse or direct to the consumer.
If you were an entrepreneur yourself right now, looking across the value chain, where would you go, and what's the challenge that would drive you to that part of the value chain?
There's two. I'll mention two. One is, and this is consumer packaged food, consumer foods related, so slightly more downstream. I mentioned Nutri-Score before in our conversation. I would love to go there where you come up with a product that has a consistent A label. And the reason why I say that is that I'm of the full belief that the consumer is going to look at the attributes of food much more than at just a brand. That brands will be changing over time, and that it's much more important what the Nutri-Score label is. There's now talk of having some sort of climate label. Right. I have to see how that will be, and consumers will look at that. So capturing that in a good way, I think is where you should invest in, as in being a different proposition to the big brands in consumer food. So that would be one area where I put my money. The second area, which is much more with a long-term view, and I wouldn't bet my house on it just yet, but I'm very fascinated by what it may mean, is lab-grown meat. We are in the era of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, which are, I'm not sure whether they're disrupting the market yet, but they're making a lot of noise at least, and consumers are getting aware that there are alternatives. Yeah. While I'm not entirely sure whether all consumers will buy lab-grown meat, because it may sound artificial. That's what others would say. You would say. Some consumers might buy into that, and I don't know whether it will economically work out. But from a supply chain and a sustainability point of view, wow. Yeah. And we haven't done the calculations just yet. But I'm one of the strategists, as I mentioned before. We came together recently and we talked about 15 years out. And the one topic for me, for the strategies covering the grains and oilseed sector and the strategies covering the animal protein sector was this. Because if lab-grown meat takes off, soybeans, beef, pork, what will happen to them? Well, it will come down.
Right. That could really disrupt.
And it could really disrupt. So from an economic point of view, it will disrupt. But it will also potentially be very beneficial to all the sustainability and climate targets that we've set out. So But again, I'm not sure whether it's viable just yet. So I wouldn't bet my house on it.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested to follow what's going on there.
So if you were to bet your house on one of two people, who would it be? The entrepreneur who sees the issues around soy, water, farm labor, like really from the emotional, like this is broken, we need to fix it. Or Unilever saying we're running out of this here, it's getting too expensive. Who do you think would be the brand that would deliver the actual solution in 15 years from now?
Both. Which is a bit of a funny answer, but Unilever will buy that entrepreneur that has the right product for the Unilever portfolio. So in the end, I would bet with Unilever, who I think are much more purpose-led than they were 10 years ago. I'm convinced they are, and they're not there yet, as you also said. But with the recent acquisitions that I did, for example, the vegan Sir Kensington mayonnaise, and the vegetarian Butcher, which is a meat substitute company that I bought. Yeah. They are buying those companies that fit in your first category that have this purpose, and they slot it into their broader distribution system, and they bring branding, marketing, sales techniques to those companies. So it could be a win-win even. So that's why I say both.
Yeah, and actually I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of hesitate around that because they think that they're selling out to the machine. You're like, but if your goal is to fix this and you can't scale it yourself fast enough.
Yeah. Be part of the machine is, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
I mean, it can be a really great vehicle.
Yeah. So find the right one, and because what we see is that some of these entrepreneurs sell out to the highest bidder.
Right.
Then also be honest to yourself and sell out to the one that is going to really change or potentially might help change the world, and not the highest bidder.